A poor woman found a girl abandoned in a trash can. What she did later left everyone in shock. Natalie lived in a small neighborhood on the outskirts of the city where life was marked by simplicity and daily struggles. Widowed and childless, she led a solitary existence in a modest house, sustaining herself with small jobs that barely met her basic needs. The neighborhood, though united by poverty, had always welcomed her with affection, but life wasn't easy, and each day felt like an endless battle. That afternoon, the sun was still shining brightly when Natalie left her house to take the trash to the curb. With slow steps, she crossed the small yard of dry earth, feeling the day's heat reflecting off the dry ground. As she approached the communal trash can, an unexpected sound caught her attention. It was a faint, almost inaudible cry that seemed to come from inside one of the trash cans. Confused, she stopped and tried to locate the source of the sound. Her heart began to race as she realized the cry was coming from a specific trash can, an old metal one, barely standing upright. With trembling hands, she removed the lid and looked inside, not knowing exactly what to expect. What she saw made her step back for a moment, completely shocked. Inside the trash can, wrapped in some dirty, worn-out cloths, was a newborn baby, small and helpless. Her eyes widened in disbelief, and for a second, she thought her senses were deceiving her. But the baby's continuous and desperate cry brought her back to reality. "My God, what have they done to you?" she murmured, her voice choked with emotion. Without thinking twice, Natalie extended her arms and, with utmost care, lifted the baby out of that improvised prison. The child, barely strong enough to cry, clung to Natalie's chest, seeking the warmth it had lacked until then. Natalie looked at the baby, feeling a mixture of sadness and tenderness flooding her heart. There was nothing she could do to understand how someone could have abandoned such a small and defenseless being. She knew she couldn't leave that child at the mercy of the cruel fate that had almost taken her, so in an impulse, she decided to take her home. Upon reaching her small home, Natalie placed the baby on her bed, improvising a crib with the few sheets she had. She watched the small being, now sleeping peacefully, feeling a strong connection forming between them. It was as if that baby, found by chance, had come to fill the void that life had imposed on her. "I'll call you Leah," she whispered, gently stroking the baby's face. "I don't know where you came from, but I will protect you, my little one." However, Natalie knew she couldn't keep the child forever. The city had no orphanages, and her financial situation was precarious. She knew the right decision would be to take the child to the police, hoping they would find her real parents or at least a better home for her. With a heavy heart, she wrapped Leah in a blanket and headed to the local police station. There, she was received by Officer Jacob, a man with a firm but kind look who listened attentively to her story. "We will do our best to locate the girl's family and find out who left her in that trash can," he said, with a tone that conveyed both security and compassion. Natalie nodded, but as she left the police station, a feeling of uncertainty dominated her. Although she had done what she considered right, the idea of separating from Leah deeply disturbed her. At home, while watching the little one sleep, she made a silent decision. No matter what happened, she would protect that child at all costs. After all, fate had united them for a reason, and Natalie was not willing to let that bond break so easily. Night slowly fell over the humble neighborhood where Natalie lived, bringing with it the silence that for many was a relief. But for her, it meant the return of memories she tried so hard to forget. Sitting next to Leah, who slept peacefully in the improvised crib, Natalie couldn't help but let her thoughts return to the past, to a time when life, though simple, was full of love and hope. Natalie clearly remembered the day she met Arthur. He was a simple man with hands calloused from hard work as a bricklayer, but with a generous heart and a contagious joy that brightened even the most difficult days. They met at a small neighborhood party, and since then they never parted. They married shortly after, uniting their lives in a small home that, despite poverty, was filled with happiness. The love between them was what sustained Natalie in moments of difficulty. Arthur worked hard to provide for the family, and though money was scarce, they always found ways to smile and enjoy each other's company. She remembered the nights when he would come home exhausted, but always with a smile on his face, bringing flowers he had picked on his way back. The couple's happiness was complete when Natalie discovered she was pregnant. The news brought a new glow to their lives, a dream of a family that now seemed to be coming true. Arthur was radiant with the prospect of being a father, and together they began planning the future, imagining what the baby's room would look like and what name they would give to the son or daughter that was to come. But life, with its unpredictable cruelty, had other plans. On a fateful day, while Arthur was on his way to work, a runaway truck hit him head-on. Natalie remembers that day as if it were yesterday. The phone call that made her drop everything, the despair when she arrived at the hospital and found Arthur severely injured, and the moment the doctors informed her that he hadn't survived. The shock of the loss was devastating. Natalie felt as if the ground had been pulled out from under her feet. At the same moment she learned of Arthur's death, a sharp pain pierced her body, and shortly afterward she learned that she had also lost the baby she was carrying. The miscarriage was a cruel blow, a confirmation that everything she loved had been taken from her in the blink of an eye. Without Arthur, without the baby, and with a shattered heart, Natalie sank into a deep depression. Days and nights blurred into a whirlwind of pain and despair. She lost her job and the will to live, becoming dependent on the help of her neighbors to survive. The people in the community, moved by compassion, offered what they could. But Natalie felt like a shadow of her former self, unable to find the strength to move forward. However, with time, the raw pain began to transform into a constant but manageable sadness. She learned to live with the absence, to deal with the void that Arthur and the baby had left. But the smile, the joy of living never returned, until the day she found Leah. Now, with little Leah in her care, Natalie felt something new inside her. It was a mix of hope and fear. Hope that perhaps this child was a new chance to give and receive love, to fill the void that life had left her. But there was also fear because she knew her circumstances were precarious, and raising a child alone would be a monumental challenge. Natalie watched Leah's small face, feeling the responsibility weighing on her shoulders. She knew that life with Leah would be difficult, that there would be many struggles, and that alone she would have to face poverty, the lack of resources, and the judgment of a society that might not understand her decisions. But at the same time, there was something undeniable about that child, a reason to keep fighting, to seek a better future. The first weeks with Leah were exhausting. Natalie had to relearn how to care for a baby, something she thought she had left behind with the loss of her child. The sleepless nights, the improvised diapers, the scarce food. Everything was a constant struggle. But amid all that, every smile from Leah, every small gesture of affection gave Natalie the strength she needed to keep going. And so, while the world around her continued its relentless course, Natalie clung to Leah as her last hope, her last connection to a future she feared to imagine, but that now seemed a little less bleak with the presence of the little one in her life. The days turned into weeks, and Leah's presence in Natalie's life became increasingly indispensable. The daily routine, once marked by loneliness and sadness, was now filled with the sounds and movements of the little girl. Natalie, despite all the difficulties, felt a new purpose in her life. She cared for Leah with all the love and dedication she could offer, as if the little girl were her own daughter. However, the constant fear of losing Leah to an uncertain fate never left her heart. Jacob, the police officer in charge of the case, was determined to find the girl's biological parents. He knew that this was the only way to ensure that Leah would have a safe future. Natalie, on the other hand, found herself torn. She knew that the police were doing their job, but at the same time, she feared that if they found Leah's real parents, they would take her away from her. The local community, upon learning of Natalie's situation, began to get involved in different ways. Some neighbors, moved by empathy, started helping Natalie with supplies, clothes, and even money, knowing the difficulties she faced in caring for Leah. This solidarity brought some relief to Natalie, who now had people to rely on in the most difficult moments. However, not everyone in the neighborhood was so understanding. Gossip began to spread quickly. Some residents, perhaps driven by envy or suspicion, started questioning Natalie's decision to keep the girl. Malicious comments about how a poor woman without a husband could care for a child began to circulate. Others questioned whether Natalie had made the right choice by involving the police, suggesting that it might have been better for her to keep the girl in secret, away from the authorities. These murmurs deeply affected Natalie. The whispered words on the corners, the suspicious looks as she walked with Leah through the neighborhood alleys, all contributed to increasing her insecurities. She felt isolated, even with the help of some neighbors. Doubt settled in her heart. Was she making a mistake by becoming so attached to Leah? And if the police found a better home for the girl, would she be ready to let her go? Jacob continued his investigations with dedication, but the case proved more complicated than he had expected. There weren't many clues, and the lack of records at the maternity hospital made it difficult to identify Leah's biological parents. However, he didn't give up. He knew that for the child's sake, it was essential to find out what had really happened. Meanwhile, Natalie found herself increasingly attached to Leah. The bond between the two grew stronger each day, and the idea of parting from the girl caused her indescribable pain. She spent sleepless nights thinking about what she should do. If she handed Leah over to the police, she would be doing what was right. But her heart told her she would lose something more precious than anything she had ever had in life. Leah had filled a void that Natalie didn't even know still existed, and the prospect of losing this new reason to live terrified her. Natalie's dilemma worsened when, on a rainy morning, Jacob appeared at her door with a serious expression. He had news, something that could change everything. "Natalie," he said in a lower voice than usual, "we found a man who claims to be Leah's father. We need you to come to the station to clarify a few things." The news hit like a bomb. Natalie felt the ground tremble beneath her feet as she tried to process what Jacob had just said. Leah's father. Who could he be? And why had he only appeared now? Questions began flooding her mind as the fear of losing the girl she loved so much grew within her. With a heavy heart, Natalie knew she had no choice. She had to go to the station and face whatever was coming, but deep in her soul, a flame of hope still burned. Maybe, just maybe, fate had other plans for her and Leah. However, the uncertainty of what awaited her at the station made her uneasy, and the possibility of having to hand Leah over to a stranger terrified her. As she prepared to leave, Natalie looked at Leah, who was innocently playing on the living room floor. Her eyes filled with tears, but she forced herself to smile. "No matter what happens, my little one," she whispered, "I will always be here for you." And with those words, she took Leah in her arms and set out to face an uncertain future, knowing that the search for truth was just beginning. The tension was palpable as Natalie walked to the station, holding Leah firmly in her arms. With each step, Her heart beat faster, mixing anxiety, fear, and a sense of inevitability. The news that Leah's supposed father had been found kept echoing in her mind. Who was he? And why was he only now appearing to claim the child? When she finally arrived at the station, she was greeted by Jacob, who silently escorted her to a small meeting room. Upon entering, she saw a middle-aged man sitting at the table. His features were strong, with grey hair at the temples, but his expression was serene, almost melancholic. When he saw her enter, he immediately stood up, and his eyes fixed on Leah, who was resting peacefully in Natalie's arms. "Natalie, this is Ronald," said Jacob, breaking the tense silence. "He claims to be Leah's biological father." Natalie hesitated for a moment before sitting down at the table. She didn't know exactly what to expect, but the sight of Ronald left her confused. He didn't seem like the kind of person who would abandon a baby in a trash can. There was something sincere in his gaze, something that made her wonder if there wasn't more to this story than she initially imagined. Ronald, sensing the distrust and apprehension in Natalie's eyes, was the first to speak. "I know it must be hard to believe me," he began, his voice low and laden with emotion, "but I never wanted this to happen. If I had known, if I could have prevented it, I would have done anything to protect my daughter." Natalie remained silent, watching Ronald's every move and intonation. She needed to hear his story, to understand what had brought him here. Meanwhile, Leah, unaware of the tension in the room, moved her little arms, innocently grabbing Natalie's finger. Ronald took a deep breath before continuing. "I live in a nearby town, about an hour's drive from here. My life has always been marked by work and responsibilities. A few months ago, I met a woman who became Leah's mother. Our relationship was brief but intense. I really believed we would build a family together." With each word, Natalie felt a mix of conflicting emotions inside her. Ronald's story seemed sincere, but she couldn't shake the fear of losing Leah. How could she trust a stranger, even if he claimed to be the girl's biological father? "When it was time for Leah to be born, I was out of town on business," Ronald continued, his voice trembling slightly. "When I returned, I was informed that Leah's mother had disappeared shortly after leaving the hospital. I couldn't find her, and there was no sign of my daughter. It was a nightmare. I searched for her everywhere, but I only found vague clues about her whereabouts. Until now, I never imagined my daughter was so close." Natalie felt a pang in her heart upon hearing these words. If it was true, then Ronald had suffered as much as she had. But what about Leah's mother? Why would she abandon her daughter? These questions swirled in her mind, unanswered. Jacob, who had remained silent until then, intervened with his usual professional tone. "Ronald, we understand your situation, but we need to follow protocol. We've already collected samples for the DNA test, and until the results come in, we can't make any decisions about Leah's custody." Ronald nodded, understanding the need for caution. He looked directly at Natalie, trying to convey sincerity in his gaze. "I just want what's best for Leah," he said softly. "I know you've cared for her with love, and for that I am eternally grateful. If the results confirm that I am her father, I want you to know that you will always be welcome in her life. I don't want to take her away from the person who saved her." These words caught Natalie by surprise. She had imagined a confrontation, a dispute, but what she found was a proposal for understanding. Despite everything, her heart was still divided. Part of her wanted to believe Ronald, but another part, the one that had gone through so many losses, refused to let Leah go so easily. The following hours were pure agony. Natalie returned home with Leah, but the weight of uncertainty left her restless. Ronald's words echoed in her mind, and she couldn't shake the image of the man who in a way seemed as lost as she was. When the phone rang days later, informing her that the DNA test results were ready, Natalie felt a chill down her spine. It was the moment of truth, and she knew that regardless of the outcome, her life and Leah's would change forever. With one last look at the girl sleeping in the living room, she took a deep breath and prepared to face the fate that awaited her. The day Natalie returned to the station to hear the DNA test results felt like an eternity since the moment she found Leah in the trash can. Every step towards the meeting room brought with it a mix of anxiety and hope. Upon entering, she was greeted by Jacob and Ronald, both with serious expressions reflecting the gravity of the moment. Jacob didn't take long to announce the result. The test confirmed that Ronald is Leah's biological father. Natalie felt a pang of sadness and relief simultaneously. The fear of losing Leah hit her hard, but at the same time, the confirmation brought a strange sense that the pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together. Ronald was indeed the girl's father, and now the question was how to deal with this new reality. Ronald, visibly emotional, took a step forward. "Natalie, I have no words to express how grateful I am to you. You saved my daughter. If it weren't for you, I don't know what would have happened to her." He paused, trying to control the emotion in his voice. "I need you to know that I will do everything in my power to ensure that Leah has a good life. I will take care of her with all the love and resources I can offer, but I also want you to know that I don't intend to push you away from her. You are an important part of her life now, and that won't change." Natalie listened to every word carefully, but still a cloud of distrust lingered over her thoughts. Ronald seemed sincere, but the trauma of so many losses made her cautious. She knew she couldn't make a decision based solely on words. Her protective instinct was still on high alert, and the idea of blindly trusting Ronald was something she couldn't accept immediately. "I appreciate your words, Ronald," Natalie replied, trying to hide the tension in her voice. "But I need time to think. Leah, she has become a part of my life in a way I didn't expect. It's not easy for me to accept all of this suddenly." Ronald nodded, understanding Natalie's hesitation. "Of course, Natalie, I completely understand. You don't have to decide anything now. Just know that I'm here to help with whatever you need." At that moment, Jacob intervened, changing the focus of the conversation. "Now that we have confirmed paternity, we need to understand what really happened that led to Leah being left in that trash can. Ronald, you mentioned that Leah's mother disappeared after her birth. We need more details." Ronald took a deep breath, as if preparing to relive a painful period in his life. "As I said before, our relationship was brief. Leah's mother, Jessica, was a complicated woman with many personal issues. She was unstable, and I knew that from the beginning. But when we found out she was pregnant, we tried to make it work. I really believed we could be a family." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "On the day Leah was born, I was out of town on business. When I returned, I was told that Jessica had left the hospital with the baby, but no one knew where they had gone. I searched for her, hired investigators, but every lead ended in a dead end. It was as if she had disappeared into thin air." Ronald's expression hardened. "I never knew what really happened until now. The idea that my daughter was so close, and that I couldn't do anything to protect her, it destroys me." Natalie watched every detail of Ronald's story, looking for any sign that might indicate something beyond the words. But as he spoke, a part of her began to believe that maybe he was telling the truth. Still, questions about Jessica persisted. Jessica, could she have done something like this? Abandon her own daughter? Natalie asked, her voice low but laden with emotion. "I don't want to believe so," Ronald replied, sadness in his eyes. "But the truth is, I no longer know who Jessica became. She changed a lot during the pregnancy, and perhaps deep down, she wasn't ready to be a mother." As Ronald spoke, Jacob received a message on his cell phone and frowned as he read it. "It seems we have a new lead on Jessica," he said, looking at both of them. "Investigators found a record of her at a nearby clinic shortly after Leah's birth. Apparently, she was seeking help, but never completed the treatment. We need to look into this further." The revelation added a new level of complexity to the case. If Jessica had sought help, it could indicate that she was struggling with something beyond her control. Perhaps she had abandoned Leah in a moment of despair, unable to cope with the circumstances. Or worse, maybe someone had forced her to make that decision. Natalie felt a new wave of uncertainty wash over her heart. The answers she had been seeking seemed within reach, but with each new piece of information, new questions arose. One thing, however, was clear. Leah's story was far from being resolved, and Jessica's role in it still needed to be fully uncovered. As the pieces of the puzzle continued to fall into place, Natalie knew her fight for Leah was just beginning, and with Ronald by her side, she would have to decide if she was willing to trust him to protect the little girl who had become so precious to her. The weeks that followed were marked by growing tension. Natalie continued to care for Leah with all the love and dedication, but the shadow of the investigations into Jessica hung over everyone. Ronald remained present, offering support to Natalie and participating in the investigations led by Jacob. The wait for the outcome was agonizing, and both Natalie and Ronald knew that regardless of the result, nothing would be the same as before. Finally, on a cold, cloudy morning, Jacob called Natalie and Ronald, summoning them to the station. He didn't give many details, but his voice suggested that something important had happened. Natalie felt a chill run down her spine. The feeling that everything was about to change accompanied her all the way to the station. Upon arriving, they were led to a small interrogation room. There, sitting tensely, was Jessica, the woman who until then had been just a distant figure in Leah's life. She was younger than Natalie had imagined, but her eyes carried a heavy burden of suffering and guilt. There was a mix of anger and despair in her expression, as if she herself was struggling to understand the decisions she had made. Natalie and Ronald sat in silence as Jacob began the interrogation. The atmosphere in the room was dense, and every word seemed to weigh heavily in the air. Jessica avoided looking directly at Natalie or Ronald, but eventually she began to speak. "I never wanted things to get to this point," Jessica began, her voice trembling. "When I found out I was pregnant, everything changed. I wasn't ready to be a mother. My relationship with Ronald was intense, but I knew deep down that we weren't ready to raise a child together." She paused, wiping away the tears that started to stream down her face. "After Leah was born, I entered a state of despair. I was overwhelmed by a fear I couldn't control. Fear of failing, of not being good enough, of being alone. I didn't know what to do, so I ran away." Natalie tightened her arms around Leah, feeling the weight of Jessica's words like blows. It was hard to imagine that someone could abandon a child, especially a mother. But at the same time, looking at Jessica, she saw a woman destroyed by her own insecurities and wrong choices. "When I left the hospital," Jessica continued, "I had nowhere to go. I ended up on the outskirts of town, without money, without support. That's when I decided, I thought that if I left Leah in a place where someone would find her, maybe she would have a better chance than with me." Ronald, who had remained silent until then, finally spoke, his voice broken with emotion. "Jessica, why didn't you come to me? I would have helped you. I would never have let you face this alone." Jessica shook her head, her eyes finally meeting Ronald's. "I couldn't. I felt so inadequate. I thought that without me, the two of you could be happy. I was wrong. I know that now, but at the time, it seemed like the only way out." Jacob intervened, bringing reality back to the room. "Jessica, you understand that abandoning your daughter was a crime. The circumstances are tragic, but that doesn't change the responsibility you have. Jessica nodded resignedly. I know I will pay for this, and I accept that. I deserve it. Natalie felt a wave of emotions overwhelm her. On one hand, there was deep sadness for what Jessica had done, but there was also unexpected compassion for this woman who was so broken. Ronald, visibly shaken, was also conflicted. The revelation that Jessica had abandoned Leah out of despair and fear hit him deeply, and he knew he would have to deal with this new reality. After Jessica was taken into custody, Ronald and Natalie were left alone in the room, still digesting everything they had heard. The silence between them was heavy, laden with the weight of the revelations. Finally, Ronald broke the silence. Natalie, I don't know what to say. I never imagined things would come to this. But one thing I know, he said, turning to her with a look of gratitude and vulnerability. You saved my daughter, and for that I can never thank you enough. He took a deep breath, trying to organize his thoughts. I know this is a lot for you, but I want you to know that I don't want to take Leah away from you. I see how much you love this girl and how much she means to you, and I want you to continue being a part of her life if you so wish. We can find a way to make this work together. Natalie looked at Ronald, feeling a wave of relief mixed with a persistent fear. He seemed genuine, and his words touched her heart deeply. She knew that despite all the difficulties, Leah now had a father who was willing to care for her, but she also knew that her own love for the girl was undeniable. Ronald, sensing Natalie's hesitation, decided to reveal something more. Natalie, I know all of this is a lot to process, and I want to do whatever I can to make this transition easier for you and Leah. That's why I'm willing to rent a house close to mine. That way, you can be near Leah, and she won't have to be away from the person who cared for her with so much love. Natalie was surprised by the offer. She had never imagined that Ronald would be so generous, let alone to the point of offering a solution that would allow her to stay close to Leah. But before she could respond, Ronald continued. I also need to be honest with you about something else, he said with a slight discomfort in his voice. I didn't mention this before because I didn't think it was relevant, but now I feel you need to know. Natalie, I'm a man of many resources. In fact, I'm a millionaire. And I don't say this to brag, but so you know that Leah will never need anything. She will have everything she needs, and I want you to also know that I'm here to help with anything you may need. The revelation left Natalie momentarily speechless. The image she had of Ronald instantly changed. He wasn't just Leah's father, he was an influential man with the means to ensure a prosperous future for his daughter. But at the same time, this also increased her insecurities. How could a simple woman like her compete with everything he could offer? After a long moment of silence, Natalie slowly nodded. I want what's best for Leah. If that means working together to care for her, then I'm willing to try. But I need time. Time to understand all of this, to adjust. Ronald smiled, a small but hopeful smile. I understand. And I promise I'll be here for whatever you need, Natalie. We are a family now, one way or another. Thus, with a new understanding between them, Natalie and Ronald began to plan Leah's future. They knew the road ahead would be full of challenges, but they also knew that together they could offer the girl the love and care she deserved. The truth, as painful as it was, had finally come to light, and with it, the chance for a new beginning. With Jessica out of the picture, Natalie's routine changed drastically. Now she visited Leah almost daily, thanks to the proximity of her new home, rented by Ronald. The little girl was the center of attention, but as time passed, Natalie and Ronald began to notice something different forming between them. The visits, which initially focused solely on Leah's well-being, began to turn into more personal conversations. Ronald and Natalie shared stories about their lives, exchanged confidences, and found solace in each other. Ronald's life, marked by responsibilities and the pressure of his position, contrasted with Natalie's simplicity and resilience. However, amidst their differences, they found unexpected affinities, such as the value they both placed on family and caring for Leah. The bond between the two grew naturally and subtly. With each visit, mutual respect and admiration deepened. Ronald saw in Natalie a strength and tenderness he found in no one else. Natalie, in turn, discovered in Ronald a generous and compassionate man, willing to do anything for Leah's well-being. Despite the growing connection, both had their reservations. Ronald, accustomed to a life of luxury and business, questioned how he could include Natalie in his world without making her feel out of place. Natalie, on the other hand, struggled with the insecurity of not belonging to Ronald's universe, fearing that the differences between them were too great. But regardless of their doubts, something undeniable was blooming between them. It wasn't just concern for Leah that united them. There was a new emotion, deeper and more complicated, that both were beginning to recognize but were not yet ready to admit. And so, amid visits and conversations, the bonds between Ronald and Natalie continued to strengthen, paving the way for whatever the future held. As the days turned into weeks, the relationship between Natalie and Ronald deepened in a way neither had anticipated. The bond that had initially formed around Leah was now beginning to take on more complex contours, involving emotions that went beyond simply caring for the girl. Ronald could no longer deny what he felt for Natalie. She had become a constant and comforting presence in his life, someone he trusted completely. He admired her strength, her resilience, and the way she, despite all the difficulties, managed to find beauty and hope in small things. Ronald began to imagine a future with her, where Leah could grow up in a home filled with love and understanding. Natalie, on the other hand, struggled with her own feelings. The losses of the past were still very present in her memory, and the idea of getting involved again, of opening herself to love, made her apprehensive. There was a part of her that wanted to embrace this new chance for happiness, but the fear of being hurt again made her hesitate. Moreover, there was the issue of their differences. Ronald came from a world completely different from hers, a world of wealth, power and responsibilities that Natalie could hardly comprehend. She feared that she could never truly belong to this universe, that the pressures of public life and society's expectations would eventually destroy her. Ronald, for his part, worried about how his complex and sometimes tumultuous life might affect Natalie, who had always valued simplicity and sincerity. These fears and insecurities began to manifest in small ways. There were moments when Natalie emotionally distanced herself, fearing she was getting too involved. At other times, Ronald held back, worried about overwhelming her with the challenges of his life. However, every time the two drifted apart, it was Leah who brought them back together. The healthy and happy little girl was the center of everything. Her innocent smile and her trust in the two adults who were now her world didn't allow Natalie and Ronald to stay apart for long. Leah, without knowing it, became the link that united them, but also the challenge that pushed them to overcome their own fears. They began to talk about the future, about how they could make this work. Ronald proposed that Natalie move into his house, where she could always be close to Leah and at the same time build a new life together. Natalie, despite the growing desire to be with Ronald and Leah, still hesitated. "I'm not sure if I'm ready, Ronald," she confessed during one of their late-night conversations as they watched Leah sleep. "My life has always been so different from yours. I'm afraid these differences will end up separating us, and that could be bad for Leah." Ronald held her hands, looking at her seriously. "I understand your fears, Natalie, but I want you to know that what matters to me is that we're together. I know our worlds are different, but I believe that over time we can find a middle ground, a place where we can all be happy." Leah needs both of us, and I need you." Ronald's words touched Natalie's heart, but still, the road to overcoming her insecurities was long. She knew that loving meant taking risks, and that terrified her. But she also knew that without taking a risk, she might miss the chance to build something true and lasting. The relationship between Natalie and Ronald, like any true relationship, was full of challenges. But every day, both worked to overcome their doubts and fears, knowing that the love they felt for Leah and now for each other was strong enough to face whatever lay ahead. And so, what started as a simple shared responsibility for a child was slowly turning into something much bigger. A new family united by love, understanding, and the desire to build a future together. Time passed, and the love between Natalie and Ronald blossomed in ways neither could have imagined. The doubts and uncertainties that once haunted them were gradually replaced by a quiet certainty. They were meant to be together. Leah, who had been the initial link between the two, had now become the living symbol of their union. Natalie, who once feared the future, now found herself involved in a new life, marked by the hope and love she shared with Ronald. The differences between their worlds, which once seemed insurmountable obstacles, were overcome by their mutual desire to build a life together. Ronald, in turn, had found in Natalie not just a companion, but also the peace and simplicity he had longed for. Leah, growing up healthy and happy, was the center of this new family. Every smile from her reminded Natalie and Ronald of how much they had overcome to get to this point. The little girl, who had been found in such a desperate situation, was now surrounded by love and care. And for Natalie, that meant more than anything else. With time, Ronald and Natalie began to talk about marriage. There was no rush, but both knew it was the next natural step. It wasn't just about formalizing the relationship that already existed, but reaffirming the commitment they had made from the beginning, to care for each other and, above all, for Leah. They decided on a simple ceremony, far from the formalities that Ronald's world might suggest. They wanted something that reflected the journey they had walked together, something intimate and meaningful. They chose a small garden at Ronald's house, where only the closest friends and the neighbors who had helped Natalie during her difficult moments would be present. On the day of the ceremony, the sun shone softly, illuminating the garden with a golden light that seemed to bless the moment. Natalie, dressed in a simple white dress, walked to the improvised altar, arm in arm with Jacob, the police officer who had become a close friend and one of the first to witness the beginning of this story. Ronald waited for her with a smile that reflected the deep peace he now felt. Beside him, Leah, in a delicate dress, held a small basket of flowers, scattering petals along the way. The sight of the happy and carefree girl made Natalie's eyes fill with tears of gratitude and joy. The words exchanged at the altar were few, but full of meaning. There was no need for grand promises, as both knew what the future held, a commitment of love, respect, and mutual support. When the vows were spoken and the rings exchanged, the feeling that everything was finally in its rightful place flooded Natalie's heart. After the ceremony, as the guests celebrated, Natalie and Ronald stepped away for a moment, watching Leah play among the flowers in the garden. Ronald wrapped Natalie in his arms, and together they contemplated the life they were building. "If someone had told me a year ago that I would be here, like this, with you and Leah, I would never have believed it," said Natalie with a soft smile. "Neither would I," Ronald replied, stroking her face. "But now I can't imagine my life any other way." Natalie felt overwhelmed by a deep emotion. The journey that had begun with so much pain and uncertainty was now reaching a point of peace and fulfillment. She, who had been devastated by tragedy, was reborn through the love and the new family she had helped build. By Ronald's side, she felt complete, confident that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. And so, with the sun setting on the horizon and Leah running joyfully through the garden. Natalie and Ronald sealed not only their love for each other, but also their commitment to raise and protect little Leah. The life that had once been full of uncertainties and suffering was now filled with promises and hope. On that day, Natalie knew she had finally found her place in the world. No longer the lonely woman marked by the past, but someone who, through love and perseverance, had created a new story for herself. A story she and Ronald would continue to write together, with Leah by their side. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you did, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought about the story. See you